On this week's edition of the Going Commando podcast, we recap the ugly Week 2 loss at Detroit, talk about some of the injuries that have been going on with this team, take a look around the NFC East, and get fans ready for Week 3 against Philly. You're not going to want to miss it, so without further ado, let's get started. Welcome to Going Commando, a Washington Commanders podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Going Commando podcast. My name is Tom. I am here with my co-host Chris and Clark. How you boys feeling this week?
Not that great, but definitely a lot to unpack.
Yeah, certainly could be feeling better after a week like this, but I'll save my thoughts for later on in the podcast.
Well, why don't we just jump into it? How about this Lions game? Commanders going up to the Lions, taking an L, sadly. Carson Wentz looking rough in the first quarter, and then second half starts to roll around. He starts to pick it back up. What are your boys' takes on this game?
Well, I think expectations going into the game were extremely high, probably a little too high, just based on last week, but we came out extremely flat, as you both saw. And I think it starts with coaching. I mean, I think there were some poor coaching decisions made throughout the game, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, but also on the offensive. And I think they were just didn't really seem like any adjustments were made on the defensive side of the ball. You know, very minimal adjustments made, if any. The defense really never stepped up or gave us a chance the entire game. I thought the run defense was absolutely terrible. And really kind of looking for answers because it's just not making a whole lot of sense to me.
It was very disheartening to see and to watch, but it's nothing new with this team. You know, coming off of a nice win week 1, you know, had your problems there, but came away with a win. And like you mentioned, Chris, there was a lot of expectation coming into this game. A lot of the pundits and talking heads around the NFL thought this was going to be a shootout, which it kind of was if you count a second half resurgence from us there. But I mean, you talk about a first half that was just a complete dud. That was it. I mean, that was one of the worst first halves that I can remember watching of this team in quite some time, which is saying a lot.
Yeah, and Chris, you get to a really good point there about the defense. We see this defense up its sacks number by 1 this game from last. And you look at that linebacking core, and I mean, Clark, we've talked about it before. That linebacking core is maybe the number 1 need on this team. Jamin Davis had a half decent game. He got that really good sack early on. Our offensive line allowing 5 sacks, just inexcusable. Aiden Hutchinson, way to have a great game, young man. Absolutely great game, but you got to admit, it's kind of a fluke. Samuel Cosme had good pass coverage on him for one of his sacks. Carson Wentz literally ran into him. I just don't know how to look at this game. I think when you look at the Commanders historically, you see them do 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and this feels like our 2 steps back right now.
Going back to that linebacking core, we did see some David Mayo in this game as well, and it seemed that they were throwing this man in the quote unquote run stopping situations, and then literally every time it would be a play action pass or some sort of passing situation, he would just get absolutely exposed by literally anybody that he had to cover. And I think that again goes back to your point, Chris, of scheming and coaching. It just seemed that the Detroit Lions, they were just reading us like a book on both offense and especially defense in the second, or rather defensively in the first half. I mean, we didn't have a first down until, late in the second half or late in the second quarter rather, or if even at all. And it's a testament to that Detroit Lions coaching staff, which is kind of America's darling as well after Hard Knocks. So I think a lot of people were probably very happy to see Detroit win this game.
I mean, I think Del Rio just absolutely had no idea what he was doing out there and had no answer for anything that the Lions were putting out there. I think there was a quote from like Derek Forrest after the game, and it was something along the lines of, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what we were doing, rather, on the defensive side of the ball. They were completely reading our zones and coverage exactly right, according to Derek. And it seemed like that was, an accurate assessment. I think there were maybe a couple bright spots on the defense. I've seen and heard a lot of Jamin Davis getting a lot of flack. And I thought he actually played better than Cole Holcomb, surprisingly, because I don't really remember Cole Holcomb making any splash plays or anything like that. I do remember, like you mentioned, Tom, of course, Jamin Davis with the early sack. He had another nice kind of pass deflection, pass defended, that kind of saved us on a touchdown early in the game. So I thought he was all right. St. Juice missed a really critical interception that could have potentially put us in a position to switch the momentum again back our way.
Yep.
He needed to have that. That was a very poor drop. No defenders around him. That's inexcusable. Not necessarily a coaching error there, but again, just another missed opportunity that this defense just can't seem to take advantage of.
Absolutely. And I think just to wrap this all up here on the defensive side, it was just the poorest showing. Our secondary had a lot of issues. Clark, on the day of the game, I remember you talking to me about William Jackson the third and how he had looked a little bit iffy at
He
times.
looked terrible.
Yeah. It's hard to blame those guys, man. I mean, they gave it their all and they really put on a show that second half. So you got to feel for him. But Amon-Ra St. Brown having the game of his life. That was one big note that I had from this.
He was really
Also,
good, man.
oh, he looked amazing. He set that record. What was it? 8 consecutive games with a receiving touchdown.
Yeah, they showed that graphic. That was some pretty elite company.
Yeah. Oh,
Uh,
absolutely.
No, he's definitely good. I just think that we were just basically handing him the opportunities. I think you mentioned Will Jack. He's played awful these first 2 games. And
Very
honestly,
awful.
I didn't really see too much great out of him last season. I mean, I know he got a little bit better as the season went on, and I know he was a little banged up here and there, but William Jackson III, really hoping to see some more out of him soon, because I really don't think we're definitely not getting the value for our money's worth on that deal when we signed him prior to last season. Really kind of disappointed with his play.
Yeah, not at all. And that touchdown that he gave up, the first one to St. Brown, he kind of just tripped over himself as St. Brown was standing there, didn't even have to move his feet to catch that touchdown. I mean, that was pretty pathetic. I hate to say that word, but for a guy that we're paying to be a number one corner, he certainly needs to, show up and show up soon. But I also don't think it's completely fair to blame him only.
No, I agree.
Yeah, I've said this in the past. It just seems that we always, again, I'm not the biggest fan of the zone coverages that we play. I don't know what it is. I don't know if the schemes are, a certain way, need to be a certain way rather than another. It just seems that for years and years, a lot of quarterbacks, and even ones that you don't expect to, such as Jared Goff, just seem to have field days out there picking apart our secondary.
Yeah, and this goes back to what I was talking to you about in the offseason, Clark, with Coach Del Rio. He loves to run a zone blitz scheme, which is a great defense if you have the guys to put the pressure on the quarterback. But when you have this banged up defensive line of the Commanders, which didn't get as much penetration as I would have wished, obviously upping that sack number, but it's kind of superficial in a game like this. One thing that I really do have to give credit to, and this is for consistency more than anything else, the receiving unit of this team. Curtis Samuel, 7 for 78 yards and a touchdown. Terry McLaurin, 4 catches, 75 yards, no touchdown. Jahan Dotson, 4 catches, 59 yards, 1 touchdown. Logan Thomas, 3 for 37 and a TD. I mean, really, it was another week of spreading the ball around and getting guys open. This is how we came back in the second half, if you ask me, is this passing game.
And I feel like it's, pretty rare for this team to be able to say that it wasn't the quarterback play that ultimately cost you down the stretch. Now, Carson did have that one interception where he slightly overthrew Logan Thomas, went off his hands, bounced for an interception. But overall, Carson, I mean, he played well. He's, I think, second in the NFL in passing yards right now through 2 weeks, which is certainly not an easy feat. And again, to the receiving core, they still looked good, especially in the second half. I mean, the first half, you can honestly throw out the window. But I just really think that it's nice to see that Carson isn't completely blowing these games for us. He was keeping us in this game down the stretch. And so if you can take some positives away from this game, I think that the offense, certainly the passing game, is something that was a bright spot, especially down the stretch.
Yeah, very solid points, both Tom and Clark. I agree. First and foremost with Carson, yeah, I think he's actually been one of the bright spots on this team, over these first 2 weeks, just kind of looking at the numbers. He's looking pretty solid. And I think that in terms of leadership and kind of a guy that the guys are willing to kind of rally around and trust, I think you can kind of see that already there and developing. So I've been pleased with that. Tom, you mentioned the spreading of the wealth, and I totally agree. That's something that we haven't historically seen as much of on this team, and something that we want to continue to see. 9 or 10 receivers targeted, I think, with most of those having at least 2 or more receptions. Again, Scott Turner continuing to get creative with this offense. Not only did we see Gibson and JD have runs, we also saw Curtis Samuel on a run. We also saw Terry McLaurin on a jet sweep run, which is something you don't see that often. So despite the run game itself being largely ineffective, I do like the switching up and, kind of playing around with the different offensive schemes and formations that we're using. I think that has been solid. I think the real culprit of our offensive woes yesterday is really the offensive line. And that's atypical of how we're pretty much atypical of like kind of reviewing a normal game for us. Usually the O-line is a position of strength for us when comparing it to the other positional groups, but really kind of poor showing, I think, from a lot of our guys that we rely on a week-to-week basis, like Charles Leno. Didn't really have the best game. Chase Rouillet also, unfortunately carted off with another injury. I know he's just coming off of a major injury last season, so that was really not good to see as well. Tom, you mentioned earlier, Carson took 5 sacks. I think I read somewhere he took 11 QB hits. Really bad showing from the O-line. We need to be better. We need more time in the pocket. We need to give our run game a better chance to develop.
Absolutely. And we've got to hope that Rouillet can stay healthy, and this offensive line certainly needs to step up next week, because Philly's got some pretty nice weapons on that defensive line.
Absolutely. Jordan Davis, young kid out of Georgia. I say young kid, he's what, 6'5", 300 pounds, something like that. He's an absolute monster. So it'll be interesting to see how that interior of the offensive line does hold up against that young pass rush of the Eagles.
But one more point to this offense that you were saying, Chris, the spreading the wealth, the creativity, the different guys getting hands-offs. I mean, where was this in the first half? It seemed that the play calling was just very stalled or boring. We were going 3 and out consecutively.
Mm-hmm.
It just wasn't there. Why did it take a 22-0 deficit for us to wake up and start getting more creative on offense and spreading the wealth? That's something, again, that was very disheartening to see. And hopefully, we don't have that same kind of start next week.
Yeah, I wish I had the answer for you, Clark, but I really don't. It's more of the same. We saw a lot of this last season, slow starts, and then we're struggling to kind of catch up the whole second half. And a lot of times it's just not enough. So again, really disappointing and disheartening to see this kind of trend of slow starts continuing this year. Really hope that's not the case next week.
We also have to talk about, in the fourth quarter, Ron Rivera, we score a touchdown, but rather than kicking the extra point, he elects to go for 2 to cut it to what would have been a 6-point deficit rather than a 7-point deficit. I know they call him Riverboat Ron, but that really just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and sometimes we have seen Riverboat Ron have issues calling a game in a way that fans would see as correct. Clark, I know you've had a lot of issues with this. I personally didn't mind the call. They had to get 2 points at some point during that drive. Even if they had not gotten on that one, they would have had to attempt it the next time they scored a touchdown if they had.
No, we would have been down by 7. No, we would have been down by 7 if we just kicked the extra point.
Well, 7 to tie, 8 to win. And I'm not here to tie the games.
I mean, I guess if you're an analytics guy, sure, but I just want to play football, give your team a chance. You were down 22.
Oh, absolutely. But 2 points does give them a chance to win rather than tie. So we can bicker about this all day, but either way, I found it to be somewhat reasonable within the flow of the game. If you remember, Curtis Samuel catches a 2-point conversion during this game. Just an overall interesting game from start to finish. I mean, you talk about the first to second half change, but how about the fact that we actually had more rushing first downs than Detroit did, surprisingly enough.
Maybe because they were ripping off a 50-yard run each time. You didn't need to keep grinding up first downs down the middle.
Didn't need to keep handing the ball off. Well, that could also be true, but I do find it somewhat interesting. So anyways, absolutely weird game. I'm just looking for next week in this win against the Philadelphia Eagles.
Absolutely. And kind of looking around the rest of the NFC East here this past week, we're kind of the odd team out. You saw wins from the Eagles, who we have next week, wins from the Cowboys with your friend Cooper Rush, and then our boy Danny Jones coming out with a win as well. So little bit different of an outlook than we were kind of after week 1 when it comes to looking at the NFC East. All of a sudden, we're not looking too comfortable.
Yeah, and you mentioned Cooper Rush. This was a Dallas Cowboys team, which I had kind of, I didn't even consider them in the picture of winning this game. I took the Cincinnati Bengals defense and fantasy. I believe that much in them, but obviously a big 20-17 win over Cincinnati. Now, do you boys think that shows the ineptitude of the Bengals, or do you think that shows the power of the Cowboys to overcome these issues?
I think it's a little bit of both. I don't think that Dallas is a bad football team. They just have too many talented players on both sides of the ball. Now, their offense, they lost Amari Cooper, maybe a little bit more shaky, but CeeDee Lamb's a great player. Even Ezekiel Elliott, I don't think he's a bad running back. I think that he's just been overworked, and maybe their offensive line isn't as great as it used to be in the beginning of his career. But they've got playmakers on defense that can keep them in games week in and week out, which is certainly something to, not overlook. As for Cooper Rush, he didn't look bad. I mean, he made the throws down the stretch to put them in position to kick that field goal. And really, that's all you can ask, especially out of a backup quarterback who, A, nobody's really heard of, and B, is substituting in for your $40 million quarterback in Dak Prescott. So, yeah, it was very surprising to actually see them pull out that win. And it'll be interesting to see how their Monday night game against New York Giants goes next week.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the Cowboys' resiliency really showed, and I think more likely than not, the Bengals could have been a little cocky coming into a game where they're thinking, hey, Dak's injured. We got Cooper Rush in here. This team is fresh off of losing their franchise quarterback to injury for a little bit at least. Why would we be worried? I think the Cowboys defense, on paper looked great. 6 sacks. I mean, versus the Bengals getting no sacks and virtually no pressure, it looks like. So I think likely came out flat against the Cowboys. And I think we should be worried about Cooper Rush and the rest of the Cowboys, down the stretch here. Clearly they've shown they're able to go and beat a team that was just in the Super Bowl. So clearly not a team that we need to be taking lightly.
Yeah, and I think the final point I'd make on this Cowboys Bengals game is that 6 sacks and 8 quarterback hits, or sorry, 8 tackles for loss are almost unexcusable in the modern NFL. And you look at that Bengals team, they had just gotten Lyle Collins from those same Cowboys in order to strengthen their line, and it doesn't seem to have worked out for them. I just don't know where that Bengals team is heading. I don't necessarily trust that Cowboys team down the stretch, but we'll see how it goes. And moving into the next game on the list, the New York Giants are at home with the Carolina Panthers coming into town. And the Giants end up beating the Panthers led by Baker Mayfield. What do you boys have on this game?
Somehow, some way, the New York Giants are 2-0, which is not something that I think any of us expected to happen. But at the same time, I'm not super impressed with their wins. They beat Tennessee on a game missing field goal by Tennessee. And if you look at Tennessee's performance against Buffalo on Monday night, it was very, very tough game to watch if you're a Tennessee Titans fan. Now Buffalo is one of the best teams in the NFL, but still it was an embarrassing loss. And then you look at Carolina, a team that didn't really have much expectations headed into the year. They barely lost to Cleveland in week 1. They're now 0-2. And this game was a 16-19 affair. So Daniel Jones was 22 for 34, 176 and a touchdown, kind of game manager numbers. But if you're the Giants, that's exactly what you need him to do, because he's been notorious for his turnovers over the first couple of seasons. And if this guy can just, take care of the ball, they feed their playmaker in Saquon Barkley, they have been winning games thus far. But they're going to have a big test against Dallas, even despite the fact that it's going to be Cooper Rush at QB. I still think that has the potential to be a pretty good game.
Yeah, I think, well, first off, I think Titans fans out there, it might not be the best season for you coming here, just not really off to a strong, promising start. So that could be a team that a lot of folks thought were going to be, a competitor and a contender again, potentially, and not really seeming the case. But yeah, I agree with you, Clark. I'm not really too worried about this 2-0 Giants team. Am I surprised that they're off to a 2-0 start? Yes. Am I a little jealous as well? Absolutely. But Daniel Jones doesn't strike fear into me. Neither really does the Panthers team that they went up against. So again, I don't really chalk this up to a solid, resounding win, or a win that's going to kind of strike fear into me. Really, if you look at it, neither team had scored, 19-16. That's not really a high scoring game. If you look at what our offense has been able to put up the past few games, we've been able to put up much more points than that consistently. So I would hope that trend continues for us, and that when we do end up ultimately facing the Giants, we're able to, just outscore them, even if our defense is still kind of lacking. Hopefully we can just continue to just put a lot of points on the board.
Absolutely. And remember that Giants doubleheader is back to back with a bye week in between. So they will not have any time to prepare for us other than the present. And as soon as they face us, they will absolutely know everything about our team. So interesting way to go about things. I definitely believe that this was a tight game all the way through. And I think that it's important that we, keep an eye out for these Giants as the season continues. And finally, wrapping up inside the NFC East, we have the Philadelphia Eagles taking on the Minnesota Vikings in Monday prime time. Winning a big game, Kirk Cousins losing a big game. What do you guys have on this one?
Looking to see Kirk Cousins come out with a win, but was really hoping for him to pull through here. Fortunately, wasn't the case. Did not look good at all. Eagles came out with the win and look really, really solid. I'm, concretely nervous and a little apprehensive about this game next week against them. I think they're the clear front runner in this division.
They've got a lot of talented players on both sides of the ball. They're a very good football team. People forget that they did actually make the playoffs a year ago, even though it's kind of forgotten and swept under the rug because they lost to Tampa Bay in what really wasn't a close game. But this year, a lot of people were picking them as a kind of sneaky pick to win the NFC East. And if you look at the history of the NFC East, we haven't had a repeat winner since, I believe, 2004. So Dallas won last year. It's got to be somebody else per NFC East law. And like you mentioned, Philly is really looking like the front runner. They run the ball well, both with Hurts and kind of backfield by committee with Sanders, Gainwell, Boston Scott. They've got good receivers in A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. And on defense, you still have, some of the cornerstones like Slay and Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox, but also drafting the big man that Tom mentioned earlier, Davis out of Georgia. I mean, they've got a really talented team, and they were in control of that football game the entire way through last week. So we might have our hands full heading into week 3.
Don't they have James Bradbury as well?
They do indeed. Another familiar face for NFC East fans and, Commander kind of fans. If you're a Ron Rivera fan out there, he actually started his career in Carolina, then went to the Giants, and he's a solid player as well. So they, like you mentioned, they've got a lot of really talented players on both sides of the ball. But
yeah, wish we picked him up. I mean, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, our cornerback play has been pretty atrocious these past 2 games. Really wish Ron had splurged on a guy like that this offseason for us.
Hate to say it, but Fedarian Mathis, had he stayed healthy, could have been a guy like that for us. So,
yeah, I mean, unfortunate to see him go down week 1, like we said before. Chris and I were at the game, but we got to hope that some of these other signings that we've made recently can help kind of fill the void of some of those injuries. Chris, I know you were mentioning it as well. A couple guys did get signed this week to kind of provide some insurance in case Chase Rouillet is, going to be out for a long extended period of time.
Yeah, we did have some injuries, unfortunately, in that game. Chase Rouillet is probably the most notable one. That really did not look good. He's already on IR, so we're not seeing him for at least, I think a 4-week minimum, if not longer, probably likely longer. I mean, he was carted off. And again, coming off of a kind of serious injury last season. So, obviously prayers up for Chase Rouillet. We really need him back. But interestingly enough, we signed Nick Martin, who's actually the younger brother of Pro Bowl guard Zach Martin for the Dallas Cowboys. And I did not know this. I didn't even not know he had a brother, but Nick Martin played, started at center. It looks like I did a little background on him. Started at center for the Houstons for about 3 years or so, and then was a backup in Vegas last year. So interesting to see him being brought on, and looks like he's probably going to just leapfrog the entire center depth chart at this point, with Tyler Larson still on the mend as well. So we'll be seeing, a Nick Martin probably starting for us come next week.
We got to hope that this guy can just channel his inner Zach Martin. Maybe it's something about the Martin bloodline can really just be a beast in the trenches for us. Maybe he can even get us some intel on Dallas for the week 4 game. Probably not, but hopeful, wishful thinking there.
Yeah, and I also think a big injury to talk about is Chase Young. I mean, he is still out. We saw him multiple times during the broadcast on the sideline of the Commanders-Lions game. So hopefully, hoping to see him back around the same time as Brian Robinson, a lot of the other guys that are on our IR currently. Also, for a quick note, Wes Schweitzer, pardon me, is our current listed starting center over Nick Martin.
I see. Well, that's actually great to hear, because he was out this last game because he had kind of injured him. I think it was a hamstring or some sort of leg injury in the week 1 matchup. So he was actually out in this previous game. So that's actually really encouraging to see. I trust him a lot more, given his familiarity and track record with us over the last couple of seasons. So that's great to hear. Hopefully we won't need to lean on Nick Martin too heavily then. Continued D-line depth concerns. I've said this on past episodes, and it's just getting worse each week. I mean, we had not only Fedarian Mathis go down in the first week, as you just kind of mentioned, Tom. We had Daniel Wise go down in this game. Now, I don't know the severity of his injury yet, but we'll just kind of have to see. Casey Toohill, another guy on that defensive front four who's been in rotation, he went down with a concussion early in the game. So all of a sudden, we went from having some depth that, at least Rivera feels pretty good about, to throwing out Donovan Jeter, who signed with the team like less than a week before game day, out there playing significant snaps. Now, interestingly enough, Donovan Jeter has since been released by us, and we've signed John Ridgway, who was a 5th rounder for the Cowboys this year, that we signed off their practice squad, I believe. So another new face brought into camp, and so we'll see if he gets any action. But still, really concerned about the D-line depth here. Really just need to get some guys back and healthy. I know Fedarian Mathis is lost for the year, but really need some of our key depth back in place.
Yeah, and obviously Cameron Curl, another name that is also on the injury list that we hope to see back soon. Now, looking forward to this Eagles game, boys. How do you see it playing out? I personally believe that the Commanders have a very good chance of upsetting the Eagles here. What about you?
When we went through our season predictions, I had this game as a loss. And given what we just saw last week, I'm not as confident heading into this one. Is there a formula to win this game? Yes. How realistic that everything comes together? I don't know. Because I look at this Philadelphia defense, they've got some big dudes down low to stop the run. They have some talented cornerbacks, as you mentioned, Slay and Bradbury. And on offense, I mean, this is a team that's a run-first team, but also has a Heisman Trophy winner at wide receiver and a guy that they just traded their first-round pick for and they're paying big bucks to get. So everywhere you look, they've got weapons, and I think we might have our hands full in this game. But this also is a Carson Wentz revenge game as well. It'll be the first time that Carson has faced his former team in Philadelphia since leaving over a year ago.
I love the confidence, Tom. I'm all about it, and I wish I could say the same. However, I think the formula that you're referring to, Clark, I don't think that Jack Del Rio and Ron Rivera, quite frankly, are capable of coming up with that formula or formulating it. I really don't think that this team has shown over the last 2 weeks that they're in a position to be successful in a game like this against a much better opponent, clearly. An opponent that not only has a great, a solid running game and passing game, but also the dual threat quarterback. We really haven't seen that yet. I mean, I'm not saying that Trevor Lawrence and Goff aren't mobile. I wouldn't consider them what we would call dual threat or super mobile quarterbacks, right? So I think that this is gonna be the first time that this defense has seen, a quarterback like that this season with that kind of skill set. And quite frankly, I'm worried, and I think that they're going to run all over us. I think they're going to, have a really good game against us, because I think our defense is going to look a lot like it did this past game, just kind of out of place, not knowing what to do, and completely on their heels.
I think that Jamin Davis is going to need to step up big if we want to have a chance in this game, because he's really the guy that can kind of run sideline to sideline and stay up to date with some of these playmakers, especially in the running game. We saw him have some flashes. We saw him with, again, you mentioned that pass breakup earlier, the sack. He had a nice tackle for loss, so tackle at the line of scrimmage as well last week. So, and especially with a running quarterback like Hurts, I think having fast, athletic linebackers to make plays is going to be key. So, we saw some David Mayo in the mix this week. I don't know how well that would go against this Philadelphia team. So, I would love to see Jamin Davis step up big in this one.
That's the problem, though, with this defense that Jack Del Rio has created and implemented is it relies so heavily on you having uber athletic linebackers that can not only cover at a high level, but also, stop the run and pass rush when necessary. So you ask these two guys a lot to do. And if they're not elite athletes, they might struggle a little bit, as we've seen. So I totally agree. I think Jamin and Cole Holcomb have to step up. are they capable of doing so? I don't know if they have the skill sets needed. We'll see. I think we might just not have the right personnel on this team to run the type of defense that Jack Del Rio is envisioning. We'll see as the season progresses and if any adjustments are made. But right now, I'm not so sure we have optimal personnel in place to run the defense as it should be run.
Let me tell you something right now. This Eagles team so far seems to be the biggest fluke of the entire NFL, if you ask me. If you look at their quarterback's games, he has more rushing than passing touchdowns in both the games so far. He is absolutely different from every other guy that we are going to face this year, bar none. The only comparable person that you can see with Jalen Hurts is Lamar Jackson for the level of athleticism, for the level of arm talent. Now, does this Eagles team scare me somewhat? Yes, of course. I was scared by the Lions last week. Now, do I think that means that we aren't going to win? No, we are going to win this game. Carson Wentz is going to show why he is the second best passer according to passing yards in this league. He is absolutely showing us that he deserves to have a spot here and a spot on this roster for the years to come. And I hope to see more of the same. Jahan Dotson, you are my guy. You are the person who I am starting every single week in fantasy because I believe you that much now. Terry McLaurin, he's been looking great. Let's hope that he can produce more like Scary Terry and get out of Jahan's shadow a little bit in this passing attack. Logan Thomas, great job so far, man, but I need more from you. So we'll see how this game goes, but I am absolutely confident in the Commanders' passing game and in the Commanders' defense.
The passing game certainly has given us a lot to, cheer for. And to your point about Carson Wentz, this is a really big game for him. I mean, Philadelphia, technically he's a Super Bowl champion, but everybody knows that it was, Big Dick Nick that got the job done for him. So I think definitely he's gonna have a chip on his shoulder heading into this game, and that he wants to beat the socks off of Philly. So if there's anything to give us fans, a little bit of confidence, he has been playing well recently, and this is a big game for him. So if he really wants to prove himself and be this franchise QB and the leader that he's set himself out to be, you got to show up in this game.
Totally agree. This is Carson's game to kind of prove that, he hasn't fallen off and hasn't lost it. Great opportunity to come back and get a meaningful win for him. But this Eagles team, they can put up points, and I just hope our defense is ready to kind of stand up to that challenge. We will see. We will see.
Absolutely. And let me say one last thing. Cole Holcomb, you need to step up, man. I was watching the third quarter. There was some obvious plays which he could have just made, either to stop the run or to get involved in the pass game and shut these things down. And he just seemed to be playing dead out there. David Mayo had the same thing. They're just heartbeats on the field. So they need to step it up, man. If we want to win these games and we want to be the playoff contenders that we know we can be, then we have to do it this week. All right, and that is all for the Going Commando podcast. Once again, my name is Tom. My co-hosts Clark and Chris say thank you, and as always, HTTR and HTTC.